Wellsboro, a little town in northern Pennsylvania, is where I grew up. It is surrounded by state game land. I don't live there anymore, but hunting season was really important there. Schools would even close on the first day of rifle season because half of the community would be out in the woods. My father introduced me to hunting when I was approximately 12 years old, and by the age of 23, I was hunting alone on a regular basis. This occurred during the late archery season in November of 21. I remember because the ground was already lightly dusted with snow, making it easy to monitor movement. I obtained permission to hunt a vast plot of private land owned by an elderly man. My father knew from work. The land was approximately 70 acres of heavy woods, with a small clearing and an old logging track running through it. There was also an abandoned hunting cottage deep in the woods that no one used because the roof was about to collapse. I'd been there perhaps 4 or 5 times before and never seen anyone else. That morning, I arrived at 5:15 a.m. while it was still fully dark. I parked my truck, where I always did, beside a rusting gate, and strolled in using my headlamp. The woods were completely calm. I recall having a strange feeling like I was being watched before I even got to the stand, but I just put it down to being alone in the dark, as I always do. I climbed into my tree stand, approximately 20 feet up, and waited for daylight. About an hour after daylight, I observed something that concerned me right away. About 60 yards out, I noticed another tree stand that had never been there before. I knew the property well, and I was confident it had not been there the previous weekend. It was one of those cheap ladder stands that appeared old and weathered from sitting around for years, but I would have noticed it before. What worried me the most was the lack of tracks in the snow, with the exception of a solitary trail of prints that led from deep in the woods to the base of the stand. I watched it for a while, wondering whether anyone else had authorization to hunt there, but never mentioned anything. Around 8 a.m., I noticed movement near that stand. I initially mistook it for a deer, before realizing it was a person standing behind a tree. He wasn't wearing camouflage. He wore a dingy, gray hoodie and dark jeans. He remained still, and he was looking in my direction. I wasn't sure if he noticed me at first, but then he gently raised his arm and waved. I wouldn't call it a nice, smiley wave, but more of a wave to let me know he spotted me. I returned a short wave, believing he was simply another hunter without sufficient equipment. After about a minute, he moved behind the tree, and I expected him to walk away. But he did not come out the other side. I waited and waited, but he never returned. I imagined he went farther into the trees, but I never heard footsteps. Around 10, I climbed down to stretch my legs and possibly hunt a little. I moved towards where I spotted him. When I arrived at the tree he had been standing behind, I noticed that the snow around it had been perfectly undisturbed save for my own walking tracks. There were no tracks leading away, only the single line of footprints I'd seen before leading toward the ladder stand. I followed the prints until they came to an end at the base of the stand. I looked up, anticipating. Perhaps he climbed up, but it was empty. The seat had a small covering of snow on it that did not appear disturbed. This made no sense. I remember feeling my chest tighten, as if something was extremely wrong. I chose to return to my own stand. On my walk back, I observed something attached to a branch at eye level. A strip of orange hunting vest material had been knotted in a knot. I thought maybe someone had drawn a track, but then I noticed another around 15 feet away. And then another. They were connected at varying heights, as if someone had marked something very specifically. That was the first time I pondered simply leaving. Around noon, I returned to my truck to eat and warm up. Nothing happened during that time, but I couldn't escape the sensation that I was being observed from the tree line. I almost left, but I told myself I was overthinking things. I went back in around 2 p.m. to sit till dark. This is where everything became terrible. Around an hour before dusk, I heard slow footsteps behind me in the leaves. Too hefty and spaced out to be an animal. I turned to face them, expecting to see another hunter approximately 30 yards behind my stand. I saw the same person from before. This time, he was closer, and I could see his face well. His beard was uneven and dusty, and his complexion appeared pale, as if he hadn't been outside in daylight in weeks. What really disturbed me was that he was smiling, but not in the usual way. He was barely revealing his teeth. He was clutching something in his right hand, which I assumed was a stick until I noticed the small yellow and black handle. That was a screwdriver. He said nothing. He preferred to simply stare me down with a half smile. I asked if he had permission to be on the property, but he did not respond. After about 10 seconds of this heart-pounding look, he gently turned and went away into the trees. That should have been when I left. However, I made the dumb decision to wait until the shooting light faded shortly after dusk. I climbed down and began walking back quickly. In that moment, I regretted not leaving while there was still light in the sky. About halfway to my pickup, I noticed the orange fabric strips again. But this time they were not just on the branches. Some were fastened to little sticks buried in the earth. But what really shocked me was that one of the rods had something dangling from it. The squirrel was dead. It was strung by a cable through its back legs. Although I am a hunter, I do not condone unnecessary animal suffering. Under the squirrel, a stick in the snow. Someone has made a crude circle with their boot. This was the second time I seriously contemplated running. As I continued walking, I noticed more of them. Not just squirrels, but also a rabbit and a crow hanged in the same way, like indicators or even a threat. I began walking faster. About 100 yards from my truck, I noticed something leaning against a tree that caused me to come to a full stop. It was my backpack, which I had placed in my tree stand earlier in the day. I never brought it down with me. It was zipped open, and my belongings were spread out in the snow, including my knife, flashlight, and extra arrows. They were all neatly lined up, as if someone had taken inventory. That was the moment I realized someone had gotten near enough to my stand to climb it without my knowledge. I gathered my belongings quickly and jogged the rest of the way. When I arrived at the area where my truck was, I had another unexpected meeting. It seemed like it never stopped. My driver's side door was open. I know I locked it because I usually do. Nothing inside appears to have been stolen, although my registration papers were on the passenger seat rather than in the glove box. I climbed in, closed the doors, and started the vehicle, looking in the mirror at the treeline. He was standing just inside the woods, perhaps 40 yards away. The guy wearing the hoodie. From what I could gather, he was still smiling. This time he lifted his hand again, but instead of waving, he simply pointed at me. Then he carefully drew his finger along his own throat. I left so quickly that I spun gravel all the way back to the main road. When I told the property owner what happened, he replied no one else had permission to be there. He called the game commission around 2 weeks later. He contacted my father, and said officers discovered a makeshift shelter deep on the property composed of tarps and rusty wood. Inside, they discovered animal bones and stolen hunting gear from other properties. I never hunted there again. I don't hunt alone anymore. Definitely not on unfamiliar grounds. Anything can happen when you're alone out there. However, I am not actually alone. This narrative took place in November of last year, while I was on a hunting trip with my grandfather to Crockett, Texas. I don't get to see my grandfather too much because he operates his own firm. So when he told me he wanted to go hunting, I was eager to go. I'll admit that I don't like hunting, but I do enjoy camping, and I'd never been to the lease he was driving us to. So why not? I enjoy visiting new locations, so I took a few days off from work and went down to Crockett with him. As we approached the gate, I noted that there was no traditional doorway, as there are at most places I've visited. It was simply a dirt road with an iron fence on the side of a freeway. My grandfather stepped out of the vehicle to lift the gate, and we drove down a long dirt road through the trees until we arrived at a clearing with an old house in the center. While we were walking toward the house, he informed me that his father constructed it and that they used it to go hunting or to relax and unwind from life. I could tell that it was very tranquil inside the trees. I could barely hear the cars on the freeway. It felt like an ideal weekend retreat, or so I thought. After pulling into the driveway, we unpacked the vehicle and prepared dinner for the evening. Everything appeared normal. We had old beds with linens and blankets, an old TV with a VCR, and a particularly old furnace. After we finished eating, we retired to bed at 8:30 p.m. so that we could get up shortly before dawn to go to one of the blinds. As I began to fall asleep, I heard a scratching sound coming from one of the windows with the screen on it. I didn't think much of it and fell asleep shortly after that. The next morning, my grandfather woke me up to get dressed so we could go to the blind. When we arrived, we nestled in and studied the clearing. We hadn't seen anything for a few hours, so we decided to take a nap. I awoke after barely a few minutes of sleep and took out my binoculars to gaze at the tree line. The tree line was around 1.5 miles from the blind. I swear to God, I saw someone peeking around the trees just at the edge of the woods, as if they knew we were there. It was almost as if they had been observing us the entire time. I was convinced that someone was observing us. So I woke up my grandfather. He stared through his binoculars, and then a herd of deer appeared in the clearing. He merely grinned and told me not to worry, that it was only animals. I was irritated, to say the least. I know what I saw, and it resembled someone or something. After approximately 30 minutes, he shot one of the deer, which we took back to the house to clean and begin skinning. We had chosen what we wanted for supper after gutting the deer at 3 o'clock, but we needed to go into town for some items. So we hung the deer up and headed to the store. When we returned, we found claw and bite marks all over the animal's body. My grandfather and I just gazed at each other, shocked. He looked at me and said, "We're going hunting at night." I asked him why, and he said he assumed it was coyotes, which I didn't believe. This did not appear normal. After we ate, we went out scouting with our torches and automobiles. We talked for 45 minutes before hearing anything. We came pretty near to the forest line, and I turned to see something peering out at us again. It rapidly hid when it realized I had observed it. I tried not to yell for my grandfather, so I whistled and waved him over to where I spotted it. He whispered to me to stay still and watch his back. He walked into the trees, his rifle lifted, and vanished. I remained there for what seemed like an eternity, hoping to hear something. After around 10 minutes, I heard a gunfire. I dashed into the bushes and discovered a coyote with a mutilated deer next to it. I sighed a sigh of relief when I saw my grandfather. Okay, but he informed me the coyote saw him and appeared to be preparing to attack, so he had no choice. We remained there for a time until we heard rustling in the distance, followed by the most terrifying scream I'd ever heard. It wasn't human, and it certainly wasn't an animal I recognized, but I didn't want to find out. We dashed back to the home as quickly as we could, despite hearing hard, heavy footfall and breathing coming from behind us. It seemed like we'd never make it back, but we did. We slammed the doors shut and secured all entrances. We only heard strange, screaming sounds and breathing directly outside the door. Whatever it was became frustrated and pounded at the door many times. My grandfather got tired of being terrified and shot through the door many times. It must have harmed whatever was on the other side, for it let out that horrible screech again and rushed away as soon as we could gather our breath. I phoned the police and told them what had transpired. They were obviously doubtful of the claim, but when the deputy arrived, he was also unsure what to think. We showed him everything we discovered. It seemed to unnerve him as well. Nothing came back from that call. However, we will most likely never return to that house. Kyle had been asking Connor and me to go hunting with him for 2 years, but we had always declined because neither of us knew what we were doing, and I had never been interested in hunting. Kyle was the type of guy who knew how to do things, including gutting a deer, splitting wood, starting a fire without lighter fluid, and appearing to be at ease sleeping on the ground. Connor and I were not those types of guys. We preferred the notion of a hunting expedition over the reality of it. Sitting around drinking in the mountains over the weekend sounded ideal. Hiking miles through the woods, rising up before daylight, and slaughtering an animal did not work. But Kyle eventually got us into it late one November. He claimed rifle season was open, and the weather would be cool enough to keep the pests away. He remembered an area in the mountains where he had previously hunted and rarely saw anyone else. To be honest, he mostly convinced us on the cuisine and beer in the middle of the mountains. The goal was to drive there on Friday morning, hike in, set up camp, and spend the weekend hunting. I'm not a hunter, but I'll do my best to use hunting terminology and such. Connor consented to the trip since he was willing to do virtually anything for a good tale. Later, I consented because I didn't want to be the only one still saying no, and FOMO can be overwhelming for me at times. We loaded Kyle's truck before daylight and traveled for many hours into the highlands. Kyle kept walking us through everything as if we were in a beginner class. He taught us how to keep our rifles pointed safely, how to walk quietly, what deer signs looked like, and how to detect small pathways through dense forests that I would never have spotted on my own. After parking the vehicle in a pullout along an old logging road, we hiked in for an inconvenient period of time. Kyle claimed it was only a few miles. It felt like 10 by the time we got to the spot he desired. My shoulders were sore, and my legs shook on the higher sections. We located a flat area beside a small creek and set up camp there. Kyle did the majority of the work because Connor and I were simply useless. By the time it got dark, we had the tents set up, a fire blazing, and a small ring of logs around it for seating. That first night felt ideal for a while, except for the sound of the fire and the creek running over the boulders. The woods were completely silent. We were drinking beers, reminiscing about our high school days and mocking Connor's ten-erecting skills. It was a rare and truly fantastic occasion. I recall thinking I knew why people enjoyed it. Then, unexpectedly, we heard a scream someplace deep in the woods. We all stopped chatting at once. Kyle lowered his head and listened like a hound, while Connor smiled slightly and claimed it sounded like a woman being murdered. Kyle suggested it could be a fox. He said that foxes may produce sounds similar to a screaming lady. I wanted the fox story to be accurate because the scream did not sound like a fox to me. Because it was so far away, we could easily assume it was an animal. After about a minute or two, we resumed talking, though not as casually as before. Every one of us, including Kyle, kept stopped to listen. About 5 minutes later, the scream returned. However, this time it was so close that the talk ended immediately. It sounded like it originated from about a football field away. If that. It was so loud that there was no joking after that. It sounded just like a lady screaming. One long scream ended abruptly. Connor rose up, gazing into the darkness beyond the firelight. Kyle also got to his feet. Then Connor called out, wondering if anyone needed assistance out there. I said it was a stupid thing to do. Then we all peered into the woods and waited for an answer. Nothing came back. Kyle appeared uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen before. He stated that if it had been a person, they would most likely have responded. Then he told us we needed to extinguish the fire and get into our tents. He didn't explain why, but the fire was clearly a marker indicating exactly where we were. We extinguished the fire quickly and crawled into our tents, our guns nearby. I hardly slept that night. My brain took up every small noise. I must have passed out at some time because when I awoke, the outside was gray and cold, and I didn't want to leave my sleeping bag. But when the urge to pee became too strong, I finally stepped outside of the tent. However, I saw right away that our seats were tipped over, and one of the coolers was turned sideways. A supermarket bag containing snacks was torn open and dragged several feet. Kyle's backpack was resting next to the fire ring when it had clearly been against a tree. When we retired to bed, when I called Kyle and Connor, they both came out half awake. Kyle looked around and immediately assumed a bear had passed through. It made sense. It was the easiest explanation. We hadn't hung things properly, and there was food odor all over camp. Surprisingly, not much was truly gone. More stuff was moved about than consumed or taken. Nonetheless, Kyle sounded sure, and I wanted a regular explanation badly enough to accept it. He suggested we move camp deeper into the woods, both due to the bear and to get closer to the area. He intended to hunt that day, so we packed and relocated. The second location was further from the creek, in a thicker stretch of woods along a slope. It felt a lot more remote, even though it wasn't much further in. We spent much of the day hunting. Kyle separated us, but kept us close at first, instructing us where to sit and how to watch the tree lines and openings. Connor initially handled the situation as a game, but by mid-afternoon, he had calmed down. Sitting in the woods for hours with a gun has the effect of changing your mood, whether you want it or not. Late in the day, Kyle shot a deer. It happened quickly. I simply heard the gun crack and Kyle yell for us. When Connor and I arrived, the deer was lying in a patch of brush about 40 yards away. It was a decent-sized buck. Seeing a dead deer up close was different from seeing one in a photograph. Kyle made us take it back to camp, which was awful effort. Once we arrived, he began field dressing it before showing us how to peel and break it down. I could tell Connor was trying to be interested. I felt nauseous. The scent was horrible, and the entire experience seemed violent. As a side note, my parents raised me to be an animal lover, so the prospect of going on a hunting trip was already out of the ordinary. Kyle was in his element, however. He went over every detail like he was delivering a lesson, and by the end, there were chunks of flesh packaged in the cooler and a gory mess off to the side that I tried not to look at. That night, we drank again, partially to celebrate, but also because I believe Connor and I needed it. After assisting with the deer, Kyle chopped off some backstrap and fried it over the fire. That was not our original plan for dinner. It was just a celebratory supper, if you will. I have to admit that it tasted excellent as a surprisingly enjoyable day came to an end. The shriek returned. It was distant at first, perhaps even farther than the first scream the night before. But the moment I heard it, I felt an uneasy sensation inside me. Like this again. We were all familiar with that sound by now. Nobody mentioned fox this time. Nobody laughed. Kyle glanced off into the darkness. Connor mumbled. There was no way this was happening again. We waited, hoping that was the end of it. It was not. A few minutes later, the scream returned, much closer, and this time it sounded like it was moving toward us, as it had the first night. It was completely dark by then, and the firelight made everything beyond it appear much darker. I remember having the impression that whoever was creating the sound could see us clearly, despite the fact that we couldn't see anything beyond the trees. And this made me uncomfortable. Kyle got up and grabbed his rifle. He was trying to be calm, but I could tell from his tone that he was cursing under his breath. Then, in a strange flash of drunken confidence, he raised his weapon and shot a few rounds into the air. Right after that, he began yelling into the woods like a maniac, attempting to sound bigger and crazier than whoever was there. Connor and I laughed, mostly because it was unexpected and ridiculous, and I believe because all three of us had consumed enough alcohol that our nerves had become mixed with stupid energy. But the laughter didn't last long because the scream returned, this time even closer, as if it were just a few yards outside the camp's edge, somewhere beyond the trees where the firelight had gone out. Kyle stopped yelling right away. None of us said it, but I believe we were all aware that if it was a person, the warning shots had not deterred them. We extinguished the fire again, faster than the night before. Within seconds, the site went completely black. The only light left was a faint glow from the coals and some moonlight through the trees. We entered our tents with our rifles. I lay there, wide awake. Of course, I could hear some sounds in the woods, like branches shifting and leaves crunching, but I couldn't tell what was real and what was just my imagination. Then I heard footsteps, not walking, but running quickly and hard around the tents and through the campsite. Something brushed against the side of my tent, like a dragging scratch, as if someone ran an object along the fabric as they passed. I didn't call out for Connor or Kyle because I was afraid it wasn't them. All I'd be doing was attracting the attention of whoever was there. Then it went completely still for the final time. The silence was the worst part. Maybe a full minute passed before that scream erupted in the middle of the campsite. It was so loud that it didn't sound like a normal human voice. I overheard Connor scream from his tent. I yelled without meaning to. Kyle then fired a shot through the roof of his tent into the air. The explosion was deafening. Right after that, I heard fast footsteps running through the woods. All of these sounds were amplified, and it felt like there was a lot going on. The footsteps became increasingly distant, and I couldn't hear anything for a few seconds. Nobody moved. Kyle then shouted, asking if we were all right. Connor responded immediately in a shaky voice. I'd never heard from him before. I replied to Kyle that we were all going into one tent and that there was no way we were going to stay in separate tents afterwards. We crawled into his tent, which was the largest. The three of us sat there with rifles and flashlights, barely speaking. At one point, Connor asked Kyle what the hell that was, and Kyle simply said he had no idea. Flat out. Hours passed like this. Every now and then, one of us would think we heard movement, and everyone would go back to silence. The adrenaline eventually wore off, and we all fell asleep. When morning arrived, nothing looked as bad as I had anticipated. A few items were knocked over outside. One of the beer cans was stepped on. A plastic tub had been moved a few feet, but nothing was taken. We packed up at dawn without ever discussing hunting again. Nobody wanted to spend another night. We hiked back the way we came, talking more as we approached the truck, probably because being in motion helped us feel less trapped. By the time we got back on the road, some of the fear had turned into that strange laughter that comes after a bad experience. Connor kept doing Kyle impressions, screaming into the woods and firing into the air like a tattooing warrior from Star Wars. Kyle also left. We discussed whether we should call the sheriff and report it. In the end, we didn't, Kyle explained. If someone truly needed help, they would have responded either night. We yelled back. Connor suspected it was a lunatic messing with hunters. I speculated that it could be a drugged woman or someone attempting to lure people into the darkness. Both of our explanations were frightening, and they felt like simple assumptions. To be honest, no one really knows what the explanation was. I arrived home that night exhausted and expected to sleep well, but I awoke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat from a dream. In my dream, I was back in the woods alone, and I saw a woman standing between the trees. She was covered in blood and screamed for help, and the way she looked at me still gives me chills. But I couldn't approach her. I just stood there as she screamed until I woke up. I sat on the edge of my bed, breathing heavily, reflecting on those 2 nights in the mountains and wondering what that dream was about. If my brain was telling me that I subconsciously felt guilty, what sticks with me the most now is the possibility that somewhere in all of this, there was a person out there and we chose to avoid her. I still tell myself that if someone truly needed help, they would have contacted us. They would have moved closer to the fire and said something. All 3 of us wonder if someone truly needed assistance that night, or if something more sinister was going on.